Welcome. Long ago, there lived a man who was descended from the gods. No one knew his real name, but in ancient Greece they called him Jason. This Jason was no ordinary man. After all, he had the blood of royalty running through his veins. His father was the king of Thessaly. Jason had a wicked stepbrother, though. When Jason was just a baby, this evil older brother deposed his father and took over the throne himself. Fearing his son's wrath, the deposed king wanted to hide his young son for fear that he would do something to him, so he entrusted the baby to a centaur to raise. How does it work? Jason is a descendant of the gods, but his father is a normal human being. Yes, maybe a king, but he couldn't even keep his throne. So what kind of a god is this? It's normal to question these things in today's logic, but mythology is something different. Now I want to tell you a story that was told in many versions in ancient Greece and is very well known. Maybe it is a mythological story, but I am not telling it for nothing. Of course, as always, there are very interesting implications. Now, what is a centaur like? How did his father entrust Jason to him? The centaurs are a hybrid race with human heads, human bodies, and horse bodies. This centaur could give us some clues. The centaurs are mentioned in many myths. For example, in the legends of the Turks there are very similar creatures called itbarak. If you ask me, they are hybrid creatures. Anyway, let's continue with the story. Now Jason comes from the blood of the gods, and the centaurs raise him. So imagine, when he becomes a young man, there's no one to stand against him. The first thing he did was to go to his stepbrother and ask for his father's throne. Ironically, the stepbrother accepted the request. But he had one condition. He wanted something. And what was the condition? To get the golden fleece guarded by a dragon in a distant land. Since this quest was deadly and impossible, the evil stepbrother has asked for it. The dragon guarding the golden fleece never sleeps. Jason first went in search of Argos, the master who could build the most perfect ship of all time. And Argos built him a ship like no other in the whole world. Argos, of course, had some unusual connections. For example, there was Athena, who gave the advice to build the ship out of a kind of wood that doesn't rot. Athena also had an extraordinary beam added to the bow of the ship. Notice that this beam was not just any beam. This was a magnificent piece of wood and it could talk. Argos, who built the ship, called it Argo, which means fast in ancient Greek. So the crew were called the Argonauts. And this story is called Jason and the Argonauts in Greek mythology. Let's add important information. The names of today's astronauts come from these Greek Argonauts. The Argo was big enough for 50 men. Argonauts had to be experts in different subjects. So Jason sent out a call around the country asking for volunteers. Almost every one of the assembled crew was a hero and the seed of the gods. The crew was a real phenomenon. Let's name the main ones. Melambus, son of Poseidon. Castor, the Spartan wrestler. Iphitus, brother of the king of Nicena. Echion the messenger, son of Hermes. Heracles. Hylas, the lover of Heracles. Idmon of Argives, son of Apollo. And Acastus, son of King Prius. Faunus of Crete, son of Dionysus. Argos, who made Argo, and Jason, the leader of the group. The names and duties of the crew were occasionally changed by Greek writers of different centuries. But this list is the oldest known crew list. This elite crew met Jason at the port of Pagasai on the Magnesia Peninsula to search for the Golden Fleece. Before the voyage, they had a feast in honor of Zeus, the god of gods. Then they boarded the ship, witnessed by thousands of curious onlookers. The people greeted the heroic sailors and wished them luck. The crowd did not disperse until the Argo sailed towards the horizon and disappeared from sight. But what had so many people and such a valuable crew really set out to do? To retrieve the Golden Fleece, of course. All the research tells us that this golden fleece was the fleece of a golden ram. But do you think it makes sense for the sons of gods and kings to put themselves in danger for an animal hide? Even the dragon, who is rumored to never sleep, was known to be on guard over that rag day and night. So it's a very dangerous mission? Dear friends, the golden fleece had a completely different feature. It could fly. According to the stories we have compiled from mythology, the golden fleece was once a kind of flying machina belonging to the god Hermes. In the hands of a king who could use it for his evil ambitions, it could have ended in disaster. That's why an army of heroes armed with extraordinary abilities set out. Their only goal was to recapture the relics of the Olympians of old. After a few minor adventures, Argo reached the Cappadocia Peninsula. The Dorians lived here. Their young king, Cisseus, told the Argonauts to anchor in the Gulf of Cetos, but he forgot to warn them about the six-armed giants who lived there. Unaware of this danger, the Argonauts climbed a nearby mountain. Only Heracles and a few others stayed behind to protect the Argo. So they waited on the ship. The six-armed monsters wasted no time in attacking the ship. Heracles saw them. Heracles killed several of them with his arrows before the battle even began. Meanwhile, the other Argonauts returned, and thanks to their special skills, they managed to kill the attackers. It seems that these six-armed monsters were giants. These giants could have been the Nephilim mentioned in some of the Abrahamic religions. Anyway, this story, as you can see at the end, is not a 2,000-year-old story. It is about a world in ancient times, but we don't know whether it is only about this world or another world as well. There are many stories to tell about giants. Some evidence has emerged in the last 2 centuries, but the evidence has been destroyed by an invisible hand. The German paleontologists Gustav von Königsberg and Franz Wellenbreck were astonished to find some bones of giants in the shops of Hong Kong chemists in 1941. This discovery was published in the annual report of the American Council of Technology in 1944 and, please note, very important, it was scientifically documented. Archaeologists excavating in Syria found axes that only giant hands could wield. 32 by 22 centimeter stone tools unearthed in eastern Morocco probably belong to the same giant people. After all, Dr. Louis Burkhalter, former French representative of the Foundation for Prehistoric Research, wrote in the 1950 edition of the Revue du Musée de Beirut, in the books of the Abrahamic religions, in the Popol Vuh of the Mayans, in the Sumerian epic of Gilgamesh, and in the Norse Germanic epics, stories are full of giants. Who could have dictated these unanimous stories about creatures that never existed? By the way, in the Greek epic world, giants are not only mentioned in the story of the Argonauts. They are also mentioned later in the Odyssey. The marbles surrounding the magnificent altar of Zeus on the hill, the Acropolis in the city of Pergamon, in what is now Turkey, are all decorated with gigantomachy, that is, images depicting the battle between the giants and the gods. By the way, the altar of Zeus has not been in its Turkish location for nearly a century, but in Berlin, Germany. The Argonauts rested in Phineos's kingdom for 40 days. While a group of Argonauts stayed on the ship at night, others were hosted in the king's palace. They replenished the ship with provisions and built an altar in honor of Jupiter. On the 41st day, the Argo sets sail and travels along a winding river or a canal. When floating islands with dangerous rocks soon appear, it is time for Ephemeos to take control of the ship. At first, the towering cliffs on both sides of the canal appear tranquil, creating a sense of calm. However, the Argonauts, being mindful of the various dangers they might encounter, devise a cunning solution and dispatch a bird in advance to assess the situation. When the bird approaches the 2 huge boulders, they suddenly close in, as if to block the passage. Then, with a steady movement, they open again and the bird can pass. As the bird glided through, all its feathers were caught and torn by an unseen barrier resembling an invisible curtain or a net. Dear followers, if we don't just see this narrative as mythology and look carefully at the details in the narrative, upon observation, it becomes apparent that the two rocks function as a type of sensor. Their role is akin to that of a hatch, and when opened, they generate a distinct magnetic or electricity-like barrier. This barrier, in turn, rips off the wings of the bird. But even today we don't understand what kind of technology this is. It's impossible not to be amazed. The argonauts, observing the opening and closing motion of the rocks, synchronize themselves to the movement and run away just as it opens. Remember, Athena had given them so much information during the construction of the ship that thanks to this divine advice, the Argo was built with great strength and was almost unsinkable. But it was also impossible to eliminate all dangers with the help of the gods. Let us now carefully interpret this very old story. Tipis, the helmsman of the Argo, calmed his friends. They had narrowly escaped being crushed between the rocks, and they could never have done it without the help of the gods. Because we are accustomed to seeing this narrative as a 2,500-year-old Greek tale, small details have been overlooked for hundreds of years. For example, shortly after the adventure of the colliding rocks, the Argonauts see Apollo flying over the ship in his flying craft. There is an even more interesting detail. A vehicle similar to the Vimana of Hindu legends is described. And according to the story, Apollo tells the Argonauts that he has gone to visit people from another race. What was the world like back then? During the journey, the Argonauts' experienced guide Tipis falls ill and dies. Jason and the Argonauts build a pyramid over his grave. This is interesting. As we know, pyramids are usually of two kinds. Those with a triangle at the top, which we see most famously in ancient Egypt, and those with a flat top, which we call ziggurats. Ziggurats are found in the Middle East and South America. So we have never seen such a thing in the Greek geography. Now please let us interpret the passage in this 2,005 centuries-old narrative together. They were anchored on a deserted shore when suddenly they were attacked by birds. The birds were shooting sharp and deadly arrows at the Argonauts. The Argonauts tried to defend themselves. The Argonauts covered their heads with their shields, forming a wall of protection along the length of the ship. Some of the Argonauts also began to make a terrible noise that disturbed the birds. So, finally, the birds fly away. With our knowledge 50 years ago, we might not have understood any of this. But with today's technology, we can say that these birds are some kind of unmanned aerial vehicles. We also see that a jammer is used to interrupt the software or communications of the robotic birds, or so I detect. After this adventure, our heroes landed on another shore. There they found 4 people who told them where the Golden Fleece was. The Golden Fleece was in the hands of King Aeetes. So the crew, including Jason and the other heroes, asked the gods and goddesses for divine help. Perhaps the biggest help was given by Eros, who shot the arrows that made people fall in love. Because after the king's daughter Medea ate the arrow of Eros, she could see no one but Jason. King Aeetes' palace was surrounded by a security of soldiers. With the help of the gods, a fog rolled in, and our crew took advantage of it to appear in the presence of King Aeetes. The king was stunned because he suddenly saw a crew of 30 men. They greeted the king very respectfully and said in a calm voice that they were the rightful owners of the Golden Fleece and that they had come to take it back to their country. King Aeetes first laughed at this audacious request, but remained calm and told them to pass 3 obstacles, and if they did, he would gladly give them the Golden Fleece. The first obstacle was to slay the fire-breathing metal bulls. The second was to defeat the skeleton warriors that grew out of the ground, and even Jason himself was skeptical about the last obstacle. The final hurdle was to defeat the dragon guarding the hide. The dragon breathed searing fire, but he remembered that he had applied the miracle ointment given to him by Medea, the king's daughter, who had fallen head over heels in love with him. The ointment was like a shield protecting his body against all weapons and burns. That was how he had gotten past the flame-breathing metal bulls and finally stood before the terrible dragon that guarded him where the hide lay. The dragon functioned as a vigilant sentinel, detecting any signs of peril and unleashing a formidable flame of such intensity that it had the capability to singe the foliage on the adjacent hills. Freed from the flames by the ointment, Jason threw the harpoon into the dragon's eyes. The dragon immediately collapsed. The golden fleece behind him was revealed. As soon as Jason touched the golden fleece, which shone so brightly that it lit up the floor, the fleece picked him up and flew him back to the ship. Everyone on the ship vied with each other to touch the golden fleece, but Jason forbade them to touch it and wrapped it in a big blanket. There was no time to celebrate. Both Jason and his new lover, Medea, the king's daughter, were sure that King Aeetes would come after his treasure. Never one to break a promise, King Aeetes sent a huge fleet. The ships attacked Argo from two sides. One of Aeetes' ships reached a country whose people had never seen such travelers before, and mistook them for sea monsters. Dear friends, we are now opening a parenthesis here. In the Ethiopian Book of Kings, Kebre Negeste, there is a similar story. Baina-Lehkem steals the greatest treasure of all time, the Ark of the Covenant, from King Solomon, his father. Solomon sends his best warriors to retrieve it. The chase goes from Jerusalem to Axum in Ethiopia, partly by flying machines. It seems to me that the same story is told in different versions in different societies. Doesn't it feel that way to you too? As our heroes approach Crete after escaping the angry king's fleet, they encounter a gigantic guard that circles the island of Crete 3 times a day. He was called Talos. According to the conclusion drawn from all the descriptions, Talos is a metal being, and it is known that he was created by Hephaestus, the son of Zeus. Hephaestus is both the god of fire and evidence, and the protector of blacksmiths. So Talos was also a being of iron. The only way to defeat Talos was to have a slack under a skin-covered nerve in his ankle. An attack here would cause his white blood to flow. In the narrative of 2,500 years ago, of course, there was no vocabulary to say that this iron creature was a robot. As far as we understand, this robot had a weak spot in its ankle. Our heroes somehow defeated Talos and continued on their way. I have just told you about a book that was transmitted 2,500 years ago. This is a well-written tale that would make even the creative directors of today's advertising agencies jealous. Let's quickly go through some parts of the tale again. Fire-breathing bulls have metal feet. There is a dragon that never sleeps and is always on the lookout. It breathes fire and never dies. In the details of the story that I have not told you, there are a lot of talking amphibious creatures. In another part of the story, a god illuminates the earth with flaming arrows. A metal robot circles around an island. It sees approaching ships and stones them. Its blood looks like molten lava. I call it motor oil. A woman, a descendant of the gods, can also confuse this robot with imaginary visions. And a skilled hacker who is able to corrupt the robot's software. A goddess uses fog to make people invisible. Birds shooting deadly arrows are attracted to sound. You can't expect me to believe this timeless tale from a storyteller who compiled and wrote all this. Ancient Chinese tales tell of dragon kings descending from the sky to the earth. It is said that dragon kings founded the first Chinese monarchy. No human weapon could harm them, and their fire-breathing dragons were undaunted by enemies. The flying machines of the dragon kings made a terrible noise, and the founder of the first dynasty was called the Son of the Red Dragon. This is not simply Chinese mythology. The fire-breathing dragon motif has influenced Chinese art for thousands of years. Those who think that these are just stories made up by ignorant people of the time can still go to the famous square in Beijing today and see the temple to the sacred dragon emperor. The Greek civilization, the foundations of which the West has laid today, gave us a boost with mathematics, philosophy, sociology, and many other sciences. While we do not doubt their intelligence and wisdom, seeing their beliefs as fancy tales makes us, not them, look ignorant. One evening in Athens, Plato was telling these and similar stories when one of his listeners asked him, "When did all this happen?" Plato replies, "These things have been handed down to us from Solon and the ancient sages. Perhaps all these events happened thousands of years ago." This is written in Plato's book, CRÍTAS. Thanks to Göbekli Tepe, we can trace the history of human civilization back 2,000 years. However, if we break the chains in our brains, we can find in all kinds of traces that our civilization is not only 12,000 years old on this planet, where we have lived for millions of years. Stay in good health.